Crash Bandicoot 4, it's about time. This game, man, I'm obsessed with it. It takes everything from the original trilogy that fans loved and kicks it up a notch. The art style, the gameplay, the story, all amazing, but what I personally love about Crash 4 is how it seems like a fresh new start for the Crash series. But what if Crash 4 is literally a new start for the character Crash Bandicoot? Crash 4 introduces the idea of a larger multiverse to the series. Despite the game's subtitle being It's About Time, it's also about space. Crash and Coco don't simply travel through time, they also travel to several universes with the help of the Quantum Mask. A lot of these universes are vastly different from the Bandicoot's home one, but with the inclusion of a second Tawna, we can confirm there is at least one parallel universe even if we never see it. That's when it came to me. What if all the other Crash games take place in parallel universes? Crash canon does seem to have no concrete form. Since the property has been thrown around to different companies, there isn't necessarily a clear-cut continuity, but this can all be easily explained with a multiverse. Today I would like to go over my interpretation of the Crash Bandicoot timeline. Now there's no official timeline like the Zelda one, so this video is mostly speculation. I would also like to warn you that this video would contain spoilers of basically every Crash game including the most recent one, since I will be summarizing the story of each game. So if you plan on finishing one of the games, then finish it before you watch this video. Now with that out of the way, let's jump right into it. I propose the idea that the Crash Bandicoot series has 3 main timelines and 2 minor ones. Since there are no official names, I'll give them some myself. Our first timeline will be called the Prime Timeline, the second one will be the Titan Timeline, and the last one will be named the New Timeline. We'll get into the 2 smaller ones once we've reached a certain point in their respective parent timelines. There will also be a few games in an area I will call outside of time. The events in these games either don't fit in with any specific timeline or will theoretically create their own little timeline. Now that we're done with that introduction, we'll start our first timeline with clowns. No, don't click on a video, I swear this is going somewhere. When Naughty Dog was developing the first Crash games, they had what they called the Developer's Bible. It was filled with concept art and the lore unseen in the games themselves. One of these pages gives the origin story of Neo Cortex. Neo actually came from a family of unsuccessful traveling clowns instead of scientists. Despite his origins, Neo was a super genius even as a toddler. On the verge of being fired from the circus show they worked for, the Cortexes decided to show the ringleader their pathetic-looking, premature, balding, hyper-intelligent 2-year-old in clown makeup. The ringleader found this hilarious and Neo became the star of their act. He was further abused for physical comedy much to the joy of the ringleader and audience members. Then one day when Cortex was at age 5, everyone a part of the circus was mysteriously killed in a fireworks accident except for Neo. Free from his tormentors, Neo decided to seek a higher education. Despite still being a child, Cortex enrolled into high school. As expected, he was a social outcast who was constantly bullied for his age and strange appearance. However, he made friends with another outcast named Nitro. The two dreamed of enacting revenge due to the constant abuse they received from their peers. Lucky for them, there just happened to be a nuclear power plant explosion that destroyed the whole town and everyone in it. But coincidentally, Cortex and Brio just happened to be in an old marine test bunker. Yeah, as you probably guessed, Cortex was behind both of the explosions that killed his enemies. No wonder he's so obsessed with placing TNT and Nitro crates throughout the levels of the Crash series. Cortex and Brio would do this find a new place and blow it up when everyone starts hating you thing for years, until the two of them ended up on the international most wanted list. The evil duo eventually took refuge on the Wumpa Islands off the coast of Australia after purchasing what would become Cortex Castle. They would spend the next 5 years developing 2 dastardly devices, the Evolvo Ray and the Cortex Vortex. When used on an unsuspecting animal, the Evolvo Ray increases the target's intelligence, durability, and strength, as well as changing their anatomy to be more human-like. Cortex and Brio would then put the newly mutated animals through the Cortex Vortex to put them under their mind control. At some point, Cortex would also develop a factory to create an endless amount of identical lab-assistant androids to do the grunt work around the castle. Due to the location of their new headquarters, the duo rounded up several native Australian fauna, from potaroos, koalas, kangaroos, and yes, bandicoots. The first experiment was done on Ripto, who was blasted twice with the Evolvo Ray, causing him to turn blue and insane. They quickly abandoned him and he found his way to one of the island's ruins. Eventually, after evolving several animals, Cortex's ultimate project involved mutating 3 bandicoots, Crash, Tawna, and Coco, whose whereabouts at this point in the story are unknown, at least in this timeline. Crash is meant to be the general of Cortex's mutant army, the Cortex Commandos, while the other two seem to be reserves in case something went wrong. Due to Cortex's impatience to ready the Vortex for Crash, it rejects the Bandicoot and he escapes capture from the two evil scientists. Cortex and Brio decide to replace Crash with his girlfriend, and it's up to him to stop Cortex from brainwashing Tawna and taking over the world. When Crash wakes up on Insanity Beach, he meets the Protector Mask Aku Aku, who helps him on his quest to stop Cortex. It's then from here that the events of the first game occur. Crash makes his way through the Wump Islands while collecting gems to stop Cortex. He is of course successful and he saves Tawna, who then leaves him for Pinstripe in this timeline.
That's rough, buddy.
At some point between Crash 1 and 2, Crash and Coco reunite and live in peace for 1 year. Meanwhile, after his defeat, Cortex discovers the power crystals whose planetary energy can be used to power a space station-sized Cortex Vortex to enslave the entire planet. At some point he teams up with the cyborg Dr. N. Jin after Brio cuts ties with him for the time being. In Crash Bandicoot 2, Cortex strikes back. Cortex tries to manipulate Crash to collect the remaining power crystals, while N. Brio tries to convince the Bandicoot to collect the gems to power a laser to destroy the second Cortex Vortex. In the canon ending, Crash and Coco help Brio blast Cortex out of the sky, and peace is restored, until they realize that
Uka Uka is free. No, it cannot be.
when the space station crashes into the Earth, it unintentionally frees Aku Aku's evil brother, Uka Uka. It turns out that Uka Uka was the real villain all along, as he was the one who encouraged Cortex's evil plans in the previous games. Or at least I think. It's not really clear what their relationship is and how it began. Maybe when Cortex and Brio first arrived on the islands, the evil mask somehow telepathically communicated with them or something? Anyways, Uka Uka is angry at Cortex's failures, so he pairs him off with a time-traveling doctor, Nefarious Tropy, the creator of the Time Twister. The evil trio plans on using gems and crystals from different time periods to take over the world. The events of Crash Warped then occurs. Crash and Coco stop Cortex, Entropy, and Uka Uka, and send them to a realm outside of time. This is where things get weird. Somehow all three of them escape from their time prison and return to Earth. And instead of enacting their revenge, the Bandicoots, scientists, and other mutants decide to go kart racing. Yes, I'm arguing that Crash Team Racing is canon. It's referenced directly in the future title, so I think it's only fair to claim that it's canon. What starts as a friendly race turns into a matter of life or death when the Gasmoxian racer Nitrous Oxide invades the planet and challenges the fastest racer on Earth. The main cast then compete to find their best racer to defeat Oxide to avoid total planetary enslavement. Whoever is chosen for CTR's adventure mode beats Oxide and he goes back to Gasmoxia. We have now reached the end of the Naughty Dog era of Crash Bandicoot, and have entered the start of his decline. Outside of this timeline we have the events of Crash Bash. Aku Aku and Uka Uka are arguing for some reasons, so they abduct the Crash Cast to fight for them because
the ancients would not allow it.
whatever that means. I guess this battle doesn't count for some reason. It's just a pretty mediocre party game, not much story-wise here. The only reason I'm saying this would hypothetically take place after CTR is because Oxide is the final boss. Sometime after CTR, Wrath of Cortex begins with Uka Uka being angry at the villains due to evil being at an all-time low. Cortex then reveals his secret project, a fourth Bandicoot named Crunch. The team of villains use the power of the elemental mask to strengthen Crunch and collect the crystals and gems again. Crash and Coco catch wind of this and put a stop to his plans yet again and free Crunch from his mind control. The Bandicoot family now has a new brother. This is where we reach our first real divergence in the timeline. Let's quickly cover this new alternate universe. I'm going to call this branch the Subordinate Timeline. Basically at this split is where the Crash Game Boy Advance games occur. In Crash Bandicoot The Huge Adventure, Cortex shrinks the world and Crash puts a stop to it. In Crash 2 End Trance, Cortex decides to sit this one out in what I believe is the only game in the series that doesn't have Cortex as one of the antagonists. Uka Uka calls on Entropy and an interdimensional brainwasher known as N-Trance to destroy Crash and brainwash the other two Bandicoots. And as expected, Crash defeats two of them. Then thirdly is Crash Purple. Yeah, this game sucks and muddies up the continuity of everything beforehand. Apparently Crash and Spyro the Dragon have always existed in the same universe and the two of them have to stop Ripto and Cortex. Yeah, it's stupid. That's the end of the Subordinate Timeline. Before we return to the Prime Timeline, we must cover another game outside of time, Crash Nitro Kart. This is the one where Emperor Valo the 27th kidnaps Team Bandicoot and Team Cortex to race for their planet. This one takes place outside of time because it has to happen after Wrath of Cortex since Crunch is there. But that can't be possible since Twinsanity takes place right after Wrath of Cortex, since Cortex gets frozen at the end of Wrath of Cortex. So it's impossible to have both CNK and Twinsanity to occur in the same timeline. Back to the Prime Timeline. 3 years after the events of Wrath of Cortex, Cortex tries to assemble a team consisting of all of Crash's enemies to destroy him. This plan is however interrupted by the return of Victor and Maurice, the two birds Cortex tested the Evolvo Ray on, who now call themselves the Evil Twins. It turns out that the prototype Evolvo Ray sent them to the 10th dimension as well as mutated them. Crash and Cortex along with Cortex's niece decide to team up to stop the twins from destroying the world. Cortex's niece, Nina Cortex, actually appeared in Crash Purple where she acted like a very small child rather than a moody preteen. This is one of the reasons why I believe the Game Boy games occur in a different timeline due to Nina being so different in Twinsanity. This is where we reach the end of the Prime Timeline with Crash Tag Team Racing. Cortex, Nina, and Engine are chasing the three Bandicoots when they end up in Ebenezer Von Clutch's Motor World theme park. He's missing like his heart or something and they agree to help him for some reason. It was a subpar racing game, end of timeline. Sadly, it only gets worse from here. Also, Crash Boom Bang happens outside of time because its placement in any timeline isn't clear, and also the game is a worse experience than projectile vomiting. We have now reached the Titan timeline. Before we actually get to any games, we once again need to go further back to events we don't directly see. In this timeline, Nia and Cortex, rather than Brio and Cortex, use the Evolvo Ray to create Crash and the other mutants as we see with this cutscene. Unfortunately, from this point the Crash of the Titans, we don't exactly know what happens with this change in origin. All that can be assumed is that similar events to the Prime Timeline have occurred due to callbacks and characters from previous entries being in the Titans games. All you really need to know about Crash of the Titans and Crash Mind Over Mutant is that Cortex and Nina create super mutants called Titans and attempt to use them to collect a force known as Mojo to take over the world, and like usual Crash stops them. End of timeline. We have now reached the most recent timeline, the new timeline. This timeline begins with the Insane Trilogy. For the most part, this game is a retelling of the events of the first 3 Crash games with very minor changes. The biggest change would be the optional ability to play as Coco in Crash 1 and 2 via time travel. Crash Team Racing Nitro Fueled is also just a retelling of the original CTR. However, for the sake of continuity, I'm going to assume that any bonus content outside of the classic mode adventure is not canon. So all the Nitro Kart and Grand Prix content did not actually happen, at least in my interpretation. I do really like the new Nitro Squad though. A big change outside the games themselves would be Cortex's origin. In Cortex Castle at the end of Crash 4, we see pictures of what can be presumed to be Cortex's parents. As you can see, they're not clowns. It seems like Cortex inherited his castle in this timeline, rather than buying it like in the Prime one. Another big difference has to be the reason behind Crash's stupidity. It turns out it was himself due to a bootstrap time paradox. We also get to explicitly see a Coco origin story in the flashback tapes. We have now reached Crash 4, It's About Time, my new favorite game in the series. Crash 4 begins with Cortex, Entropy, and Uka Uka in their time prison from Crash Warped. They've been there so long that they've grown into adults again. We also finally get an explanation how they escaped. After years of attempts, Uka Uka rips a hole in the fabric of the universe. This in turn awakens a quantum mask, 4 masks in charge of maintaining the time-space continuum. Crash, Coco, and some unexpected allies now must collect all 4 masks to stop Cortex and Entropy. It is during their journey that we are introduced to the alternate Tawna Bandicoot. We will now cover the 5th and final timeline, the Tawna Timeline. Now, almost all of this is speculation. We don't know much about Tawna's timeline other than Entropy is now a woman instead of a man, Tawna became an adventurer, and Crash and Coco were killed by Lady Tropy. Here's my hypothetical take on what occurred in Tawna's timeline before she was dragged into the new timeline. Due to Tawna not reacting to Cortex's presence at all, I have reason to believe that he either does not exist in her timeline or was not involved in any of the events that led to her creation. Let's just say in her timeline, Embryo created the mutants single-handedly. Just like in the Prime and New timelines, the Cortex Vortex, or I guess Brio Vortex, rejects Crash and he escapes. However, this time Tawna escapes with him. The couple go on the same journey that Prime Crash does, but this time their motivation is to save Coco. They are successful in their quest and Tawna gets filled with a new sense of adventure the Prime Tawna never had. At some point, Uka Uka is freed and he calls on Lady Tropy to take over the world. The Bandicoot trio go to stop her, but unfortunately Crash and Coco are killed by Entropy. Tawna is still successful in stopping her in the end, but she decides to go solo after losing her loved ones. At some point, Lady Tropy is found by the original Entropy and they team up to rebuild the multiverse in their image. Tawna catches wind of this and finds a tear in time-space to follow the evil time travelers. She eventually bumps into the other Crash and Coco, and her story continues in the way that we see in Crash 4. Okay, let's summarize. The Prime Timeline consists of Crash 1, Crash 2, Crash Warped, Crash Team Racing, Wrath of Cortex, Twinsanity, and Crash Tag Team Racing. The Subordinate Timeline consists of events from the Prime Timeline up to Wrath of Cortex, Crash the Huge Adventure, Crash Entranced, and Crash Purple. The Titan Timeline consists of events similar to the Prime Timeline, Crash of the Titans, and Crash Mind Over Mutant. The new timeline consists of the Insane Trilogy, CTR Nitro Field's Classic Adventure Mode, and Crash 4. The Tawna Timeline consists of events comparable to Crash 1, events comparable to Crash 3, and her involvement in Crash 4. And finally, Crash Bash, CNK, and Crash Boom Bang take place outside of time. And there you have it, the Crash Bandicoot timelines. Tell me what you think of my interpretation of the story of the Crash series in the comments below. Tell me what you liked, what you didn't like, whatever you want. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.